Let's break it down. Suppose that in this position, we are already castled, and at this moment, we play the move knight to c3. If that is the case, black will respond with the powerful move bishop to g4, and this pin is extremely strong for black's pieces, as white will have no effective way to break free. For example, if white tries to escape the pin by moving the queen to e1, black will simply capture the knight, and I imagine no one wants to play with such a weakened kingside. If, instead of this, white tries to drive away the bishop with h3, black will maintain the pin with bishop to h5, and there is no way to escape it unless white pushes the pawn to g4. However, since the king is already castled, this move can be very risky, because black can sacrifice the knight by capturing the pawn. Once white recaptures, the bishop will take back, and the pin is re-established. And here come black's reinforcements with knight to d4 and queen to f6. This is extremely dangerous and uncomfortable for white. This is what I call a pin attack. But now, let's suppose that instead of playing knight to c3, white advances the pawn to c3 instead. Chess is like that, quite complex. And now, with this small change, everything changes. This pin is now a complete waste of time and the main strategic mistake often made in this type of position. But I will not be the one to explain it in advance. I will let Garry Kasparov himself, through one of his games, show us why. Garry Kasparov is participating in a simultaneous exhibition and opens with e4. Black responds with e5. Then comes the most typical move, knight to f3, attacking the e5 pawn, which black defends with knight to c6. After this, Kasparov chooses the Italian game with bishop to c4, and black mirrors the move with bishop to c5. Now, white continues with the important move c3, aiming to gain full control of the center with d4. However, black counters with knight to usv6, attacking the e4 pawn, which white defends with d3, reaching one of the most critical positions in the Italian game. In this game, black castles immediately, and white follows suit. The game now continues with d6, and let us remember, when black plays d6, they relieve the knight on c6 from its defensive duties over e5. This allows the knight to move to a5, threatening to capture white's important light-squared bishop. This threat cannot be allowed, so white retreats the bishop to b3, ensuring a safe haven in c2, one of the benefits of having previously advanced the pawn to c3. After this, we arrive at the most instructive moment of the game. When black decides to place the bishop on g4, the main strategic mistake commonly made in this type of position. And I say in this type of position because it can occur with either the white pieces or the black pieces, in the Italian game or even in the Ruy Lopez. For example, if white had played bishop to bf5, black would respond with a 6, forcing the bishop to retreat to a 4. Then, after b5, the bishop would drop back to b3, reaching the same position, with the only difference being that black's pawns would now be on a 6 and b5. Back to the game. To understand why, in this structure with pawns on d3 and c3, bishop to g4 is a strategic mistake, let me ask you a question. What is the role of this bishop? This is an extremely important piece for black, as it moves on the opposite color of their central pawns. The primary role of this bishop is to oppose white's strong bishop on b3, so when the bishop moves to g4, it forgets its main duty and engages the wrong opponent. Kasparov, of course, understands this perfectly and seizes the opportunity to corner the bishop by immediately playing h3, gaining a tempo, since this move was already part of his plan. For black, the least harmful option would be to acknowledge the mistake and retreat the bishop to d7 or e6. However, if black has committed to placing the bishop on g4, it is clear they intend to maintain the pin with bishop to h5. Now, let us notice something important. Unlike the position in the introduction, the pawn on c3 denies the black knight access to the d4 square, preventing it from increasing pressure on the pin. Moreover, with the pawn on c3, white's queen's knight develops through d2. And now, allow me to ask a second question. What is the plan for this knight? As we already know, in this type of position, the plan is to maneuver the knight all the way to g3 via f1. Once it reaches that square, it will attack the bishop and break the pin, gaining valuable tempos along the way. After this, the game continues with black playing queen to di7. White responds by moving the rook to e1, Black follows up with rook to e8, and white's knight reaches f1. Black then plays knight to di8, and now white's knight arrives at g3, breaking the pin as we previously mentioned. The bishop on h5 can no longer remain on this diagonal, and with this, white has successfully freed themselves from the pin and executed their plan while gaining valuable tempos, one with h3 and another with knight to g3. If the threatened bishop captures the knight on f3, black would be giving up the bishop pair without any compensation, which is why the bishop seeks to retreat to g6. Now, something very important to consider. When playing this pawn structure, whether in the Italian game or the Ruy Lopez, after placing the knight on g3, the attacking plan continues, just as Kasparov demonstrates, by bringing the knight to h4, not with the idea of capturing the bishop, but with the intention of invading the f5 square. The game continues with black bringing the knight to e6, and now white follows the standard attacking plan with queen to f3, a strong move. The queen not only helps control the f5 square, but also introduces several tactical threats related to the knight on f6. For example, in this type of position, if there were a pawn on h6, white could proceed with bishop takes h6. After the bishop is captured, the knight would be left undefended, allowing white to capture it with the queen. This is a tactical theme that occurs countless times in similar positions, and I can assure you that if you play with this plan, sooner or later, you will have the chance to execute it. In this example, however, black did not push the pawn to h6, but instead continued with queen to e7. Kasparov then brings his knight to the critical f5 square, attacking the queen. If black moves the queen to f8 to escape the attack, Kasparov would have continued with h4, putting pressure on the bishop and forcing it to trade for the knight on f5 immediately. Because if black, for example, played h6 to safeguard the bishop on h7, what would white do? Exactly, knight takes h6. After the capture, the knight on f6 would be left hanging, the tactical theme we discussed earlier. Therefore, before moving the queen, black decided to immediately get rid of the bishop by capturing on f5. White recaptures with knight, takes f5, and the black queen retreats to f8 to stay close to the defense of the king. As a result of black's poor strategic choice to pin the knight on f3, they have now lost their valuable light-squared bishop, while white has gained several important tempos to launch a powerful kingside attack. But now, an important point to consider, what has happened with white's development? We are already on move 17, and the bishop and one of the rooks are still undeveloped. In this case, it is possible because the center is semi-closed, which dictates the pace of the game. If the center were open, leaving the bishop and the rook undeveloped would be catastrophic. But here, it is not a problem. Now that Kasparov has achieved his objectives on the king side, he returns to complete the development of his pieces by playing bishop to d2. Black responds with rook to da8, and Kasparov continues developing his final piece with rook to d1. After black plays c6, Kasparov moves his bishop back to c1 to avoid blocking the rook. At this point, the opening phase is complete, and white has achieved a spectacular position, firm control of the center, a completely safe king, and all pieces, including both rooks, fully developed and ready for the next phase of the game. Black continued by moving the bishop to ba6. Now, with everything in place, Kasparov shifts his focus to the center with d4. Black captures the central pawn, white recaptures, and black responds with d5. White, of course, advances and closes the center with f5, gaining a tempo by attacking the knight on f6, which retreats to d7, removing black's key defender of the king side. With a strong center, fully developed pieces, and the bishop pair in his favor, Kasparov decides to launch a kingside attack with h4. The black king, feeling the pressure, moves to h8. White continues the pawn advance to h5, and to stop it, black plays h6. However, this move weakens the diagonal, and the man behind the white pieces immediately takes advantage by positioning the bishop on c2. At this point, black starts to miss their light-squared bishop. Black counterattacks by targeting the rook with bishop to a5, but white is in no rush and simply moves the rook to e2. In an attempt to strike back, black boldly plays ef6. Unfortunately, this is a serious conceptual mistake because when you lose a bishop, You should place your pawns on squares of the same color to compensate for its absence. Here, however, black does the opposite, placing the pawns on dark squares, the opposite color of the missing bishop, further weakening all light squares. Sensing the opportunity, Kasparov goes for the kill with knight to h4, aiming to jump into g6 with a double attack on the king and queen. The black king tries to escape by moving to g8, but then white's queen infiltrates f5, and black deeply regrets losing their light-squared bishop. This battle was never fair. Kasparov was a professional and world champion, while his opponent was just an amateur in a simultaneous exhibition. Kasparov could have crushed any of us in the same way, or even worse. However, this game serves as a perfect lesson, illustrating the mistakes black made and teaching us how to avoid them in our own games. In an effort to survive a few more moves, black moves the queen to f7, but Kasparov swiftly invades with queen to h7. With no choice left, black's king moves to f8, but white continues with knight to g6. The black king is completely trapped, and checkmate is inevitable unless black sacrifices the queen with queen takes g6. After the capture, black has no choice but to resign. Do not forget to subscribe to support me and help me create more videos. I hope you enjoyed it. See you in the next episode.